Hello Jane, welcome to Blackwell's. It's so lovely to have you here with us today. In your book, Hearts and Minds, you're very keen to ensure that the reader knows the distinction between suffragettes and suffragists. But why is it so important that we know this distinction, and what is it?
Well, the suffragettes were the ones that everybody seems to know about. They were the militant campaigners. And they were the ones who believed that you actually needed to have deeds, not words. You needed to get out there. You needed to shock society and Parliament into giving women a vote. The suffragists were the vast majority of campaigners, men and women, because the suffragettes didn't really have men, who believed in non-violent protest, non-militant protest. And they believed that it was their job to try and persuade people that women were responsible and sensible enough to use the vote sensibly when it was given to them.
When we talk about women's suffrage, we often forget that 60% of women didn't actually have the vote in 1918, the year that we celebrate. Do you think that historians today have a responsibility to give visibility to the working class and other marginalised voices?
Oh, I certainly do, and that's part of the reason that I wrote the book. Another distinction between the suffragettes and the suffragists is that the suffragists were cultural class, generational. So we have working class women as well as aristocrats in the suffragist movement. And it's terribly important that we should acknowledge the part that they played. And as you say, they didn't get their reward in 1918, a lot of them. I write about what was called the Great Suffrage Pilgrimage in the book. And one of the major characters that I write about was a wonderful woman called Marjorie Lees, who was full of social awareness and full of passion for not just her right to vote, but every woman's right to vote. And yet, because she lived with her mother and didn't own her own house and wasn't a university graduate, she wasn't qualified to vote. She was over 30, which was another qualification, but she didn't have the other qualifications. So she, for another 10 years, was voiceless. She was silent. And it's so important that we should realise that women were campaigning with great selflessness, I think, for women to get the vote. It wasn't just a matter of me, I want a voice. It was sisterhood, it was solidarity. All women deserve a voice, and I'm going to do what I can, even if I'm not the one who's first in the queue.
Though you make it very clear that the First World War was not solely responsible for the enfranchisement of some women in 1918, is it fair to say that it had a crucial role to play?
It did. It's wrong to say, as so many people have said, that women got the vote as a reward for what they did during the war. Certainly they did amazing things during the war, and they took great responsibility, and they were wonderful administrators as well as doctors and surgeons and things in the field. But they couldn't have done that, and they couldn't have taken that responsibility had they not been seasoned by decades of suffrage campaigning before then. So it's a narrative that goes all the way through from 1866, when the first major petition went to Parliament for women's votes, right to 1918 and then beyond to 1928. And the war was a great chance for women to show what they could do, but they had actually been doing that for years before.
You say about the suffragists in your final sentence in the book, "We can't give them and their militant sisters much in return, except a promise to use the vote they fought so hard to win, and whenever it's necessary to keep on fighting." But how far are we from still achieving gender equality today?
Well, it's one of the most exciting things about this year. Not only is it the centenary of women getting the parliamentary vote for the first time, but so much is going on around that. And we get the things like the Me Too project, and we get things like the Golden Globes, where the women were wearing the black dresses. That reminded me in a strange sort of way of the pilgrimage, because the Great Pilgrimage was just women putting one step in front of the other in a long walk towards political freedom. And the women at the Golden Globes were just putting on a black dress, but it was so eloquent. And then we've got the whole gender pay gap thing going on. It's a really, really live subject. Whether that's a good thing or not is another question.
The Great Pilgrimage of 1913 was a demonstration of, in your words, conviction tempered by tolerance, conciliation and good humour. Reading your account of this remarkable act is truly inspiring. What can we learn today from the story this tells of ordinary people uniting to help make powerful change?
Well, I found it inspiring because it seemed to me in this campaign of the suffragists, and particularly the Great Pilgrimage, that these women believed that any little thing they could do towards this great cause would count. And I think that was quite empowering for them all. There was an example of a woman in Nottinghamshire, I think it was, who was not wealthy. She couldn't afford the time or the money to go on the pilgrimage because this thing took 6 weeks. It was a 6-week protest march, really. But she thought, I need to make a contribution to this cause because I believe so strongly in it. So what she did was save little scraps of food from the family's table for a week, and then she made them into a little parcel. And when that particular route of the pilgrimage passed close by her house, she took this little parcel and she presented it to the pilgrims and said, this is a little pat lunch just to help you on your way. And that was her contribution to the fight for the vote. And it was as valuable as the fieriest suffragette, I think.
Which woman from history do you think that women today could learn the most from?
Whoa, what a question. I think it would have to be the woman that I chose for the only biography that I've written, which was Mary Seacole. And she was a Jamaican born in 1805. Her father was a Scottish soldier. She was brought up in difficult circumstances in Jamaica. I mean, she was illegitimate, she was a girl, she had no great connections. But somehow she made her way right to the top of the imperial tree, really. She went out to the Crimea and became a very well-respected nurse. After that, she was a friend and ally of the royal family. She was an astonishing person. She wrote the first autobiography of an Afro-Caribbean woman in English. She was a hoot. She was such a funny, witty, warm woman who didn't believe in convention, reinvented herself right from the beginning. She was who she wanted to be, and I think she must have been one of the most refreshing people ever to meet.
You've written about women's history 100 years on. In 100 years' time, what woman do you think historians will be writing about?
That's also an interesting question. I hope, in a way, that it'll be the same sort of people that I have written about, in that it'll be a story of sisterhood and solidarity, and it won't be a story of the people putting their heads above the parapet, the whistleblowers, because they're great and we need them to get campaigns going. But then what we need is the groundswell behind, the crowds of people doing what they believe to be right. And I hope that's what people will be writing about in 100 years' time.
You studied English language and literature at Somerville College here in Oxford, and have also spent a lot of time working in the antiquarian book trade as an archivist. What first prompted you to become a historian?
I always loved history. I was lucky enough to grow up in a very old house, which I used to fill with adventures in my mind. Oxford was a great place to be for anybody who loved history. While I was at Somerville, we celebrated our centenary, and that was quite a big thing because we were one of the first 2 women's colleges in Oxford. That was a big deal, and that just kind of switched a little switch, I think, in my head. And then when I went into the antiquarian book business, which I'd always wanted to do, I ended up in a shop that specialised in travel and exploration. And that's where I found my way into the wonderful, bizarre, wacky, weird, inspiring world of women travellers. And once I published my first book on women travellers, I followed that same sort of path of social history through women's eyes, I guess.
You often make reference in your book to music, poetry and visual art that inspired and was inspired by the suffrage movement. What literature has most inspired you?
Well, I guess it would have to be Squirrel, Nutkin by Beatrix Potter, because at the age of 7 I put a jam tart bookmark in my library copy of Squirrel, Nutkin, which resulted in my being banned from the library, which resulted in my starting to collect books for myself, which resulted in my love for antiquarian books, which resulted in my being where I am now. So I guess it's all thanks to Squirrel, Nutkin in the jam tart.
And do you know what your next book is going to be about?
Yeah, kind of following on from this one and following on from a previous book of mine called Bluestockings, I'm going to write about the first women in the traditional professions. So law, medicine, architecture, engineering and the church. There was an Act of Parliament passed in 1919 which was supposed to open the doors for women, but it didn't.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Jane, and good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.